Let's get started. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Eric Johnson, today's speaker in our CNRE winter seminar series. So Eric is a professor of mechanical engineering as well as director of the PhD program in scientific computing here, and he's been at the university since 2010 and is a real expert in numerical methods for compressible turbulent multiphase flows. And this group develops methods as well as uses them to study problems that are related to applications in medicine, transportation, and energy. And his awards, one of his awards, are the NSF Career at our Young Investigator Award. So I'm really looking forward to letting speak today about computational investigations of cavitation damage from naval hydro to medical applications. So Dr. Eric, thank you for taking the time and also.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is a great pleasure to be here with you and to share some of my group's work on these topics. Maybe just go to the outline. So I broke down the talk in two parts basically. I'll start by talking about the work we've been doing on methods and models for compressible interface resolved simulations, and specifically in the context of bubble collapse, geared more to, or motivated perhaps more by cavitation erosion in naval hydro application. The second part, which I decided to include, I wasn't sure I was going to include it, but because this is an important effort in my group that is actually supported by ONR, though a different part of ONR. I figured I'd tell you a little bit about this because it is focused on cavitation, but for a very or motivated by a very different type of application, and that application is blast-induced. So as I get started, hopefully people online can hear me okay. If you have any questions online, just feel free to ask in the chat or even interrupt me. We're all friends here. And of course, if you have questions here, please also don't hesitate to ask me. So in my group, we've been interested for a long time by what I'll refer to here as compressible interfacial flows. These are typically flows of liquids that for one reason or the other support compressibility effects, perhaps shock and prediction of shock waves, or perhaps because of the multiphase mixtures that are involved have actual compressibility. There are a number of applications out there in this context, from kind of basic cavitation research to even hypersonics, droplet impact onto high-speed objects, shock-assisted combustion, steam explosions in nuclear engineering, cavitation that occurs in installation neutron source at Oak Ridge National Lab, as well as medical applications that I'll talk a little bit about more. And so really in all of these problems, you have this notion of compressible interfacial flows, either the presence of shock waves, the presence of multiple phases, so liquids, gases, perhaps, and then compressibility effects that may manifest in different ways in these different applications. From our purposes, perhaps for a CNRE and kind of as many of us work in the area of naval hydrodynamics, we're motivated by cavitation in naval hydro applications. These are, what you see on the bottom are animations from here, so that you can see these beautiful visualizations. I only saw Harisha before. Oh, there he is. Okay. Sorry, Harisha. So, of course, I should let Harish speak about these flows, but I think that what you can see here is a wide range of scales, complex interactions between the multiphase mixture and the hydrodynamics, and perhaps something that is less obvious, at least is a number of negative outcomes due to cavitation that include perhaps loss in efficiency or performance, noise, and what we are specifically interested in here is structural damage. And you can see in the image on the top right here here erosion and in fact mass loss that is characteristic of cavitation.
Or send out a help behind density, right?
I think someone might be. Let me see if I don't want to mute people on my own. Okay. So here, I probably don't need to say a ton more about this, but what I will do, however, is, well, first of all, I'll mention that you can, in the bottom images especially, you can see this macroscopic cavities, and by macroscopic, what I mean is something that is larger than, let's say, individual bubbles, but also all the way to individual bubbles, and those individual bubbles and modeling those bubbles is important. Here, I chose to focus on experiments. Of course, there are beautiful visualizations from PFD calculation, from Pesce's group of these flows that really have elucidated really kind of this, you know, the new diagnostics that have been developed in this context. The simulations have elucidated really some interesting fluid mechanics mechanism, and again, compressible multi-phase phenomena that perhaps had been hypothesized many decades ago, but that really right now, I think the collaboration between Harish, Mahesh, Steve has really shed some shed, no pun intended, light on these projects. So, so from my perspective, what we're interested in is maybe less the macroscopic and large scale features and what happens more at the individual bubble level, and we're interested in understanding what happens, but also be developing methods and models that allow us to study these problems. And so the key features here that we want to make sure that we represent accurately include shock waves, interfaces between fluids those interfaces may have very different densities and high density ratios, so 1,000 to 1, possibly even higher, depending on the application. There can be large interfacial deformations, meaning departures from sphericity, but also large volumetric changes that can pose challenges from a numerical standpoint to resolve results. And then also, in a number of these flows, fine-scale vertical structures. In some cases, these flows are turbulent, and so those methods that typically we would use to represent interfaces and shock waves may actually be problematic when it comes to resolving the turbulence, and vice versa. Those methods that we like to use for turbulence may not be well suited for shock waves and high density ratio interfaces. So the approach that we're going to follow here, the first part of my talk is the following: is that we are going to, instead of trying to maintain sharp interfaces, we're going to regularize the interface over 2 grid points. This is an analogy to what we call shock capturing, the most common schemes that are used in CFD to represent shock waves in aerodynamics and so on. The idea there is to introduce regularization effects, whether you call it artificial dissipation or upwinding, may depend on where you did your training, but that's an approach to represent sharp discontinuities, at least on a mesh, without generating problematic overshoots or causing instability. And there have been a number of challenges over the years with these types of methods, including spurious errors, oscillations at interfaces, the ability to capture these high density ratios for multi-phase flows. Conservation can be a problem, as well as temperature errors. So our approach here, and this is an approach that is relatively common when it comes to Eulerian descriptions of these multi-phase flows, is if we start with our compressible Navier-Stokes equations, we are going to, let's say we take 2 phases, a gas and a liquid phase perhaps. We're going to solve mass conservation equations for both of the phases. A single momentum equation, we're going to assume that the phases have the same velocity, and then a single energy equation, assuming here that the phases have the same pressure. And that if we had been if we wanted to deal with sharp interfaces, right, there would be no question here in terms of the velocities, the pressures of the phases, matching those. But I'll get to that in a second. We end up with mixture regions that are problematic. Just a quick note here to represent So the compressibility effects, we do need an energy equation, right? The thermodynamics are coupled now to the dynamics, and to represent the flow of liquids, possibly even solids, so you could do that as well. We follow these Mead-Nasson type of equation of states that are basically, that look like an ideal gas relation, but with a few extra terms that get you the right sound speeds. And so interfaces in this idea, if you think of your initially sharp interface here, I am showing here a schematic here on the right of a sharp interface in red, that we're going to have a fixed mesh here. Perhaps these vertical lines here define the mesh, and you can see that in an Eulerian setting where your mesh is fixed, you will end up with regions that would have volume fractions that are not going to be just 0 or 1s, but mixture regions, even if you consider a sharp interface, because your interface at some point will be somewhere between or within a cell, not just at the boundary. And that actually poses problems. We need to think about, first of all, how do we represent those interfaces? And we're going to represent them with the help of an equation that transports the volume fraction over time and space. And that, in addition, some numerics need to occur or need to be adapted in order to maintain a stable solution or regularize the solution such that you don't encounter overshoots that could lead to, for example, volume fractions greater than 0, greater than 1 or less than 0. But also there are challenges that those upwind numerical or artificial anticipation type methods are going to introduce indeed numerical diffusion, and that these interfaces are going to spread in space as well. And so that is something that can be problematic. If we go all the way back to, a few years back, actually not necessarily that far back, but a few years back, we've used these methods to study the dynamics of a single bubble, for example, collapsing near a solid surface. Up top on the right is a movie that is now a little bit dated. This is actually almost not quite 10 years, but I'm slightly embarrassed to say. But maybe 7 or 8 years old, an animation that I love to bring up because my students spent a lot of time putting it. My students are not big, and that we've used our simulations, these highly resolved simulations, to understand basic bubble dynamics. Both in the case of spherical bubble dynamics, what we're interested in is, let's say you have a bubble of a certain size, and you want to predict shockwaves that are produced some distance away from that bubble, that we want to account for the appropriate effects, try to balance the energy to develop, for example, a model for the pressure at some distance away from the bubble. And so we've done a number of, we've done quite a bit of work looking at the implosion phase, the collapse phase, the emission of the shockwave, how that emission is, or how the shockwaves actually have similar features that allow us then to develop a model for the pressure some distance from that collapsing bubble, or perhaps more generally the pressure that's generated on the surface that the bubble is, that is near the collapsing bubble. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to move forward here. I can always come back, and if you're interested about aspects of what we're seeing in the animation here, we can get back there. But as you're looking at these animations, I hope you are critical and questioning certain features that you're seeing here. Certainly I am, and I will be the first one to do so. And so kind of if we go back to 2020 or so, I actually had a very pessimistic view on these methods that we had been using, developing, promoting for the simulation of these types of problems. And this is for the following reasons. I'll maybe go kind of through some of these images that I have here. What I have up here is, this is showing the final stages of the collapse of a gas bubble near a solid surface. The surface here is located on the bottom of the frame, and what we're looking at is here the volume fraction field. And the volume fraction field, and this is a slice. This is not integrated in space, right? So for those experimentalists in the crowd, right, this is a slice. And if you were looking at an integrated image, maybe you might not be bothered so much by this, but because this is a slice, really there should not be regions of volume fraction varying significantly between 0 and 1. You really should be, and this here there's no phase change. right? So this is just a gas bubble. Really, you should have the gas in some region and then the liquid in the other. And so you can see, and this is really associated with the numerical diffusion that is present in these schemes. If I kind of jump here to the bottom left for an even simpler problem, here take a bubble that's just being advected in the flow for a few periods, what you can see that after some amount of time, this again shows the volume fraction, you can see that not only there is diffusion here of on the interface, but that diffusion, if you look at it, is not uniform. You can see parts of the interface that are thinner than certain other parts. That is problematic also for a number of reasons. And not only that, what I'm showing here on the right here is kind of a zoomed in version of the volume fractions, that you can get volume fractions that are actually less than 0 or greater than 1, which again is problematic. This is all numerical. And so what people might do in practice is just say, well, if I have something that's less than 0, I'm just going to set it to 0. But that actually causes problems with observations on. Perhaps the greatest of these problems of all, or greatest outcome of these issues is the following, is that what ends up happening, that the flows that we're looking at are complex. It's difficult sometimes to figure out the cause and the effect. What we do see in simulations, however, at times is that our simulations crash. They crash for the following reason, is that the sound speed somehow, or the sound speed squared is negative. We still don't know the root cause for this behavior. This is something that is well documented, well known in these kinds of interface result simulations for with compressible flows. But that is something that certainly is problematic. I'm sure you'll appreciate. And so we've been spending a little bit of time thinking about these problems and trying to come up with solutions. And so I'm going to present here some solutions to some of these problems. I don't have a solution or a single solution that or approach or strategy that will work for all of these problems, but I think we're starting to make some progress better understanding these issues. And so to do this, what I'll start with is we've been developing a phase field approach for compressible two-phase flows. This, as far as I know, is the first such approach for compressible flows with shocks, with the phase field. And what the phase field is what we're taking is, for example, the model that I showed you before, and adding some terms that look kind of like diffusive fluxes. They are basically written in terms of these J's here that are indeed fluxes of the phase field, and that, let me just skip a few bullets here, and that these fluxes are determined based on some model of the interface. So we're going to assume that this interfacial region kind of behaves according to Alan and Hilliard kind of principles of, you have, for example, nearly two-dimensional or kind of porous flow between two surfaces, that we're going to say that our interface, well, that's kind of what happens. It may or may not be correct, but that's what we're going to exploit. And certainly that's not, or we think that is an approach that early on, when the numerical diffusion hasn't acted for too long, this is a reasonable approximation. The details of the model are a bit intricate, but what I will say here is that this mechanism allows us to prescribe a desired thickness to the interface. What I mean by that is, let's say you start with a sharp interface, upwinding or numerical dissipation. Upwinding or numerical dissipation is going to cause interfaces to spread, to diffuse numerically. The reason this doesn't happen with shock waves is that shock waves are nonlinear fields that have a steeping mechanism, right? Your characteristics collide into each other to form into the shock. But this is not the case for interfaces or contact discontinuities. Those just propagate at a given velocity. And so if you have any numerical diffusion, there's no way to recover from that, unless you do something special. And so what some people do is they develop schemes that may perhaps account for what they call anti-diffusion. So you try to steepen the interface. That we find to be a little bit problematic. It's difficult to do that without overshooting then in the volume fraction, for example. The phase field, what it does is that it has kind of a term that is more kind of a diffusive term, and then terms that end up working towards compressing the interface. Again, the details here may be less important for this crowd, but I'll show you some examples of what we can do with this. Of course, we are adding a whole set of terms to the equations, and so and I will actually be the first one to admit, we don't know exactly what those terms do beyond having some properties that are actually convenient or that are desirable for the flows that we're looking at. But some of the things that we're looking for is we want to make sure that these methods, basically that that you're conserving your number of phases. So I mentioned before the fact that you could get volume fractions that are less than 0, greater than 1. But it also turns out that by the same token, you could actually get regions of volume fractions that are between 1 and 0 that imply that the summation of the volume fractions don't add to 1, and so you're creating voids and such things. And so there's things like that you want to make sure that you enforce. Boundedness is an important aspect, right? That's making sure that you don't go out of bounds, certainly the volume fraction, but we've been extending that idea to other physical quantities. Galilean invariance, thermodynamics. We want to make sure that interface conditions are preserved. I can kind of go through this, but maybe just as an example, what we can see here. So this here, let me start talking about some of the results that we have. This here is a very simple advection problem. So this, again, think of a bubble perhaps that is advecting in a flow periodic domain. And then we're looking here at the volume fraction for different of these prescribed thicknesses of the interface. And so what we can see is that if we do use a phase field, that the bubble remains very spherical, and then by tuning this parameter, we can get more or less diffuse interfaces, and that they may diffuse to this. Here we're looking at the thickness of the interface as a function of time, that they may diffuse over some time until they reach that relaxed equilibrium thickness, and then they stay constant. So we're very happy, at least in these simple problems, that we can show this kind of thing. And then the type of things you can start looking at complex problems. This is the shock level reaction in gases, actually, that I'm just going to see. I mentioned boundedness. Maybe in the interest of time, what I'll do here, very easily, I'll just say that there are aspects here that I mentioned that the sound speeds going to, or the sound speed squared going to negative values, that there are ways to make sure that we're enforcing the boundedness of the scheme, but it comes at a price. The price may be the time step constraint. Also, some of the movement solvers cannot prove that, but this is something that can be proven for some common Riemann solvers, such as Rusinov or HLL. An additional problem, though, is that the constraint, what it does is that it reduces the time step, and so it could actually reduce the time step to something extremely small, such that your simulation effectively stops. You might ask me, especially for those of you who are practitioners, okay, is that useful? If the code crashes or stops, same thing. And I think there's a little bit of a difference, right? We know that we now know why the simulations are stopping. Practically, how do you go around this? I think this ends up being more of whereas this notion, right, of achieving these sound speed squares less than 0, maybe being thought about as a verification aspect, right, kind of related to the numerics. I think the validation now is the more important aspect, is that we're missing some physics. So, for example, if we are indeed getting pressures that are that low, perhaps we should be a little bit more careful about phase change, and that a cavitation model actually might be addressing some of this. Yes.
So the negative sound speed, and so associated with the equation of scale, that's known that is that the reason, or is there something different in the need to?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and in fact, this is something we're still working on. So it is absolutely true. So if you think of your multiphase mixture going from volume fraction of 0 to 1 gas liquid. Sorry, I'm turning my back to you. I'll come on this way. That's right. The substitute is 1. And so that is a problem. But what you might expect is, for example, you might be in a region where maybe that sound speed just goes too low. But that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is that even So the way the sound speed is computed, for example, in these methods, is that it ends up being some kind of weighted average sound speed, and that it turns out that in the liquid you may end up going out of balance. So in the liquid part of that weighted average, you may be out of balance, such that even though it is a pressure that is allowable in the liquid, the mixture pressure ends up being less than what it should be or what it's allowed to be. What you mentioned, though, does have very important effects, though, in these problems. Imagine that your interface has diffused by quite a bit numerically, so especially when you bring up numerical issues. Imagine that it has diffused quite a bit, and you have a wave that's propagating through that interface, whether it's incident.
Eric, can you get closer to the mic?
Sorry. Yes, sorry. I was trying to not turn my.
Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Much better.
Okay, sorry about that. So in those regions where your volume fraction is perhaps far from 0 and 1, and you have a wave that is propagating through that numerically diffuse layer, your wave speed is going to be significantly affected. And so you're going to get artificially slowly propagating waves through that region, whereas, well, we don't actually know what they should be or what speed they should be propagating at, but that kind of that physical sound speed, that behavior that we should be getting, which we get correctly, is problematic from a numerical standpoint because of now your waves are not propagating consistently. And again, maybe an easy way to think of this is, let's say you have gas, mixture region, and liquid, and a wave that's propagating in this direction. That's, your wave is going to be propagating at whatever 1500 meters per second in the liquid, 300 meters per second in your gas. But in the mixture region at 10 meters per second, purely in that numerically diffuse region, which shouldn't be there to start with. And so that actually causes serious problems as well that I'm not going to talk about today, unfortunately. But perhaps next time I can.
And
Yeah.
these issues you list are for the phase field method? Or?
No, so that is in general. So what the phase field does, and the reason that we are excited about the phase field is that it allows us to maintain it's not a sharp it's never going to be a sharp interface because, right, your interface might be, it's always going to be at least one cell, or I guess one or three, however you want to count it, right, thick. But now we have a way to prevent the interface from numerically diffusing. So that is what the phase field is doing. And what we want the phase field to do is not affect some of these other properties. Again, we are adding terms to the equations of motion. We do believe that those terms are only relevant in those regions of numerical mixtures, but still there's a lot of work to determine that we are not doing something detrimental. Yeah. No, thanks for the questions. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll go a little bit fast here. I already talked about the problem that even if you start with n phases, you might end up with n+1 or n-1 or some different number of phases, and so you have to be a little bit careful there. But getting to maybe more interesting, and then applying the phase field with adaptive mesh refinement, which is something that we've been interested in, also can lead to some spurious effects that are problematic. What I wanted to get to here is that we've been developing this code based on an AMR framework. This is on the AMRX framework that's been developed as part of the exascale computing project, primarily at Lawrence Berkeley, but also with collaborations in other places. So we've basically taken this library, we've taken it and built our methods on top of that, and so we've been implementing these. Well, there's the model that I showed you is what we refer to as the 5 equations model, but there are different variants of that. We have other physics that are of relevance: radiation, magnetic fields, also viscoelastic and viscoplastic effects, which I'll actually talk about in a bit. And then the code is actually, so it's high order on AMR, so it's high order DG, discontinuous Galerkin on AMR. And there's certain aspects about the numeric that I'm happy to talk about in more detail if you'd like. My student William on the top right here has been really the main architect of this code, and that this is what we're excited to be using as we move forward. So to get a better idea of what happens for these bubble collapse problems, here what we're going to look at is an initially spherical bubble and an infinite sea of liquid, or
in a domain that is large enough, that is collapsing because the pressure in the surroundings has been raised by some amount here. And the amount here is actually, relatively speaking, high. This was to try to exercise our methods to relatively extreme conditions. This is a density ratio of 1,000 to 1 also, so water and gas. And so let me just play this animation again. So we're starting the bubble. This is volume fraction. So bubble starts at its largest size and it collapses. And what we have is kind of the conventional approaches on the top, low resolution on the left, conventional approach on the left, low resolution on the top, high resolution on the bottom. And so what you can see with those approaches here in the top quadrants and the bottom top left and bottom left quadrants is a numerically diffuse interface, but also you can kind of see that here the interface, there certainly are grid dependent effects, grid dependent behaviors. You can see that the interface certainly is, the sphericity is not maintained, even for the high resolution case, that here with the phase field, we're able to achieve much better resolved interfaces, but also, and we cannot completely remove these grid dependent behaviors, but certainly do a much better job there. We're able to run these problems to much higher density and pressure ratios than what we've been able to in the past. The reason that we're interested in higher density ratios is we are interested in these liquid mercury, or cavitating flows in liquid mercury in the context of oscillation neutron source. That's why we care about 10,000 to 1. Actually, it could be even larger than that. And also, there can be very high pressure ratios there in cavitation in mercury. We can look at all sorts of quantities of interest here, like the volume over time, the pressure that's generated. These are all quantities that are interesting in the context of cavitation erosion. Looking at now thinking of the same problem, but now looking at collapse near a solid surface, we're looking again at simulations with and without the phase, or without the phase field first, low resolution, high resolution, and then lower and higher resolutions with the phase field. There's a solid surface on the right here, and so reentrant jet forms, penetrates the bubble. And if you remember the picture I showed you earlier on, right, that kind of rotates this, right? These are the problematic regions that I was talking about before, are these regions of mixture that really shouldn't be there, that certainly are not observed with the phase field. Now, you'll ask me, is what we're doing with the phase field right? I still can't tell you that, but we're working towards being able to conduct or if not conduct, propose some validation studies for these problems. We've been also extending these approaches to so in the same way as we're modeling or representing these gas liquid flows, we could do the same thing with solids as well. And so I don't want to go to too much detail in terms of the models, but the types of things that we're interested in is, let's say we are looking at these bubble collapse near solid surfaces. We may be in scenarios that the solid itself could deform under the implosion of a cavitation bubble. And so what I'm going to show here is an animation of a shock that's collapsing a bubble near a solid surface. Here, this framework allows us in a single monolithic approach to represent liquids, gases, solids, including deformations along the solid surface, wave propagation in the solid. The caveat here is that we have a finite interface thickness between the liquid and the solid. Historically, there's been a lot of reluctance to be willing to pursue those kinds of approaches, but nevertheless, this is something that we think can be helpful, especially if you start thinking about the solid being perhaps some soft material that has kind of an esoteric type constitutive relation that maybe we may be able to better represent with these methods that are applicable for large deformations. And that kind of leads me, that kind of leads me to the second part of the talk, and I'll make sure not to go too long. And this is to talk a little bit about cavitation in medicine. And I think the segue from the last set of results that I showed you before, I think makes a bit of sense here. So there's a number of applications in medicine that either rely on cavitation or where cavitation occurs. This includes cataract removal, microbubble enhanced drug delivery or contrast enhanced ultrasound, removal of dental plaque kidney stone treatment, so chocolate lithotripsy. Aesthetic medicine, I think, is a term that people use for removal or large portions of I don't know if fat is a tissue. Is fat a tissue? But large portions, right, of or large volumes in a body. Focused ultrasound to homogenize tissue. So histotripsy, Jen Su here at the University of Michigan is one of the pioneers really of this technique. And so cavitation has been exploited in a number of these applications, with some of them relying specifically on the destructive effects of cavitation in tissue to achieve the goals. And so one might be to break kidney stones, one might be to homogenize tissue. One interesting aspect, at least to me, in the context of cavitation in these applications, or some of these applications, is that cavitation occurs directly in the tissue. Tissues behave in a viscoelastic fashion, and so there's some interesting interplay there between either time scales, length scales, or physics even that govern these flows. The second aspect that's interesting from my perspective is that the cavitation in this context is driven by acoustics typically. So ultrasound type pressure waveforms are used to generate cavitation. And that's, I mean, that is something that may or may not be relevant to people here. But that in these applications, cavitation is a phenomenon that is quite unique in that very high rates are achieved by these oscillating bubbles. Large strains are actually achieved as well. And that oftentimes, from a mechanical standpoint, the properties of biological tissues are not well characterized, but especially at these rates and these deformations. And so we want to develop predictive models for cavitation in soft matter, and I'll tie this to ONR applications in just a sec, if you can bear with me. Here we're going to depart from kind of the direct simulations of the full equations of motion type approaches that I showed you before and focus on much simpler models here, Rayleigh-Plesset type models. I suspect that many of you have encountered that kind of a model. So imagine you have a single bubble in an infinitely single spherical bubble in an infinite sea of liquid, or perhaps it could even be a solid, that you can reduce the equations of motion with appropriate assumptions to a single ODE that looks like a linear, like a harmonic oscillator. It's actually a nonlinear oscillator. It is possible that you have to account for, or you might have to solve for some PDEs actually, if you want to get the temperatures right, maybe the stresses and certain other effects right. But by and large, here, the model ends up being a lot simpler. And what that allows us to do is to kind of play around with the model and look at all sorts of different ways that either liquids or solids can be viscoelastic. We've developed all sorts of models to represent different behavior. But that let me skip to move to the applications of medicine, and to try to say something about the experiments that our colleagues Jen Su, her student Eli Vysavljevic, have been conducting. And so for a long time, we ended up hitting a wall, so to speak, from a modeling standpoint. The pressure waveforms that are used in the experiments are something along the lines of what you see here on the top right. This is the pressure. I'll use the term measured. It's actually not measured, but maybe inferred. But it's pretty much measured at the focal region. The problem with using the term measured is that they're not actually putting a transducer in that region for that pressure waveform, because the tissue would cavitate, and you do not want to put your fancy transducers there and have to and destroy them and then right. So this is what we think the waveforms look like. But I just want you to highlight here the units, right? These are in megapascals. So your peak positive pressures actually are on the order. It could be on the order of hundreds of megapascals. It sounds like a huge amount. It's actually not that strong, or not that strongly linear a wave. It turns out that the corresponding Mach number would be on the order of 1.05, right? So it's not a strong shock, but it's large pressures. And then the tensions, they go down to -25, maybe here in megapascals. They actually don't know how low, I guess, this can go, because everything cavitates, including bone tissue. And so these are just, really interesting conditions. And that for a long time, one of the challenges that we've been getting is that, so when you're using these kinds of waveforms, you don't just generate one bubble, but a cloud of bubbles. And we've been using these very simple single bubble models to try to model what would happen with cloud, and we could never get the right growth and collapse time scales. And so it wasn't until so one thing that we weren't sure that we were getting right either was the constitutive model, and so we've done quite a bit of work in developing viscoelastic models, and specifically accounting for finite deformations. My student Renaud Gaudron did some of this work, and some of the work was also done in collaboration with John Estrada, who I think presented earlier this year or last year at this venue, as well as Christian Frank, who's now at the University of Wisconsin, and that our models, we've been able to validate them against laser-generating cavitation bubbles. So these are laser cavitation experiments in water, and then polyacrylamide gels of different molecular stiffnesses or concentrations effectively. So very good agreement there, which has been exciting for a number of reasons. The first one is that with this validated framework, and I mentioned before, right, tissue properties at those rates and those conditions are not known. It actually provides us with a strategy to characterize materials at these strains, at these strain rates. And so John Estrada, Christian, Frank from the experimental side, and then Carlos Bajaras from my group, we kind of came together and developed a way or a strategy to characterize soft materials at these very high rates that we term inertial microcavitation rheometry, or IMR. So there's an app that exists that you can use, and what you need in order to use this is some radius versus time data. Here the bubble is going to have to be, or this applies only to spherical bubble dynamics, but there are extensions that my colleagues have pursued to look at perhaps non-spherical dynamics. Christian and then David Hennon at Brown University actually developed models to characterize brain tissue, and I'll explain why we're interested in that in a bit. This is brand new data. For brain tissue, so actual brain tissue, both fixed and fresh tissue at a variety of frequencies, and so this is just data that has been very exciting to see. Before I get to the final point of the talk, I just wanted to say a few words about, so up until this point in this context, we've relied on laser-generated cavitation bubbles. The primary reason is that it's easy is certainly the wrong word, but it's from an experimental standpoint, it's much more straightforward to achieve a single bubble, very spherical bubble, with these laser type systems. And acoustically, it's very difficult to do that. If you use these ultrasound transducers, you generate a cloud typically. But recently, John Sukovich, Zheng Su, developed a strategy to be able to generate a single such bubble. And this is kind of what we see here. The growth, so the acoustically generated growth of a single bubble. And that, again, it is something that I'm just showing one set of images here that shows the growth and collapse. This is extremely, extremely difficult to get, as far as I can tell. And that even with that said, if you look at this image where the bubble has its large size, you can see that it's not super spherical, but we'll live with that. This is actually in water even. It's actually worse in tissue. But so with these custom devices, what they were able to do, and this is something I think some people here may be interested in nucleation. So we're looking at nucleation from a very different angle. So as they were developing these transducers, what I'm showing here in the bottom here is radius versus time data. So there's about 100 of data sets here. So the different colors correspond to different experiments. And here they have high-speed images. You look at radius versus time growth and collapse. One such data set is highlighted here in black. And you can see, in my opinion, quite a bit of scatter in the experiments. And for those of you who are experimental people here, you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, what did they do? Surely there must have been some issues with the experiments. But looking at kind of the error analysis, it turns out that the errors in the context of the spatial or temporal resolution are actually really, really tight. The error bars here, I think those correspond to the spatial errors. The temporal errors are actually even smaller than the size of those dots. So the experiments were actually, in my opinion, or it turns out we came to realize were actually perfect. And what we're seeing here is a manifestation of something very different. And that is the following, is that right, you're think of your ultrasound wave that you're focusing energy into this small region. The small region, the focal region, is actually on the order of millimeters, so it's not, you know, tiny, tiny. But in that region, we're relying on the presence of a nucleus. By the way, I should have said that these experiments were done in DI water, filtrated to I think, millimeter scale. So it's not ultra pure water, but it's not tap water, it's not seawater, right? So it's relatively clean water. And so what we think is happening here is that what the scatter that you're seeing here has to do with the distribution of sizes of nuclei. If you think about the problem, again, you're delivering this energy to these nuclei. That larger nuclei will have more energy available to grow, and therefore will exhibit a larger R versus T growth. Smaller nuclei, of course, the converse. And so what we ended up looking at is the following, and the reason that we even thought of that was that if you took the data here and normalized by, and I apologize, you can't see on the screen here, by the maximum radius, if you normalize time by the collapse time, you can see the data actually collapse beautifully, in my opinion. I'll let the experimentalists be judges of the quality there. But what that does for us is that if you think of the Rayleigh-Placid type model, is that we now have radius versus time. We can compute every single one of those terms, except for the pressure term, which we have a general idea what it should look like from the transducer measurements that I mentioned. And it turns out that this transducer measurement, if you just take the huge tension there and use that tension as the driving pressure, and so, you know, the problem is you don't know what happens at the very small sizes because you don't have any imaging there. So what we did is we just assumed, okay, this big tension is what drives the growth of the bubble. Here's what the R from the experimental data we would get, and let's just scale this to get the right magnitude. That if you do that and fit that pulse accordingly, you can fit all of the data to within a few percent in terms of the radius versus time curves. And so we do think that this is still somewhat speculative, but we do think that this is an approach to measure not just nuclei sizes, but distributions possibly with this approach. This is something we've yet to truly demonstrate. I don't know what would happen in dirty water, but we did this in certain tissues in different agarose-based gels to obtain similar type of data. But in addition here, so not only do we not know what the nuclei or whatever the initial conditions are, but also the material properties are not that well known. The first thing that we see is that certainly there's a lot of scatter with the data, that if you try to scale things, it doesn't scale perfectly. So things are a bit messier with tissues, but we can still get some useful information. This is still a way for us to characterize tissues, not just the modulus and the viscoelastic properties in general, but also possibly what I'll refer to here as nuclei sizes, but they're really and those sizes here are on the micron scale. They're actually very close to what people think the pore size would be in those agarose gels. So we're actually, I wouldn't say this is a validation of the process, but we're pretty optimistic about what we can get from this. And so here I'll just skip to the last part here, and I'm going to try to, is 5 minutes? Fine. Okay. All right. So this is the last bit here of the talk, and this is the part that is hopefully relevant or interesting to ONR folks. And so for those of you who've been reading the New York Times or just reading about this, there's been a writer, I think his name is Dave Phillips, who's had a series of articles over the past couple of years, probably 10 such articles on, well, blast injuries. And the fact that, well, certainly there are situations that we know that warfighters exposed to blasts are injured, but that there are much more challenging situations where warfighters may be exposed to blasts, perhaps low amplitude blasts, where there are no visible external signs of injury. And so a question there is, you might ask, is how do we know what is safe when it comes to these blasts? And if you look at, actually, one of these should be an anime. I think this is a movie. Oh, well, I don't know if it played. But if you kind of look at, oh, I don't have it here. Well, what you would see when these weapons fire, you'd see all of this dust being right scattered around. I mean, you can kind of see that from here, right? And this weapon here, right, is being held on the shoulder, right? They're wearing helmets and protective gear, but you know, when you see kind of the types of pressures that are generated, there are some questions. So it turned out that until this past summer, there were no, well, certainly physics-based metrics for safety that basically, right, if you know what kind of blast pressures would be safe to be exposed to, and that it wasn't until this summer that so the deputy of the Secretary of Defense wrote a memo, and it's a bit hard for you to see here, that states that that while we're still studying this problem, a safety guideline of 4 psi in blast overpressure, right, is the guideline that is being proposed as a safety metric. And I'll ask you, right, so you know, where does this 4 psi come from? And I don't know if anyone knows or has any idea of where that number was achieved. And again, here the problem is tremendously difficult, right? Because you cannot image, you know, real time what is actually happening inside of the head, inside of the brain, right? And so how do you even set such a thing?
To reduce cavitation.
Well, I mean, you know where I'm going. You might have seen my abstract already, but no, well, so this is what we would like to do. No, so the 4 psi, this is based on experiments that have been done that show that eardrums rupture at 4 psi. Okay, so then you might ask, okay, eardrums, the brain, how does this all fit? Well, eardrum injuries is something that you can see. That's something, right? If a warfighter is exposed to it, something you can see that there's a, right, your cause, right, the blast, and the consequence, right, something you can see. And so this is the best guideline that that the field could come up with at this point. So we've been doing work on this problem, which and the work really is to you know, the goal is to try to set or better understand what is happening when these blasts propagate in the head and interact with the brain, and perhaps based on what we can learn, try to develop more physics-based or more informed metrics. And so this has been a collaboration with again, Christian Frank at Wisconsin and Rika Carlson at Robert Morris University, where we are taking finite elements modeling simulations of a blast with an anatomically accurate model of the head and of the brain. So this is Rika Carlson's work, that based on the resulting pressure fields, we are running our cavitation models to look at the growth of bubbles in, you know, that would be produced by those pressure fields in those in the brain. And what Christian's group has done is they've done these experiments of laser-generated cavitation bubbles in baths of neurons and relate the size of the bubble, basically the stretch that is experienced, to a neuronal injury. And so this gives us a workflow that, given blast profiles, we could possibly predict injury. Now, the reason, so through this mechanism. Now, what's the conventional wisdom had been up until this point is that blast propagation could lead to, well, deformations of the tissue, right, that would themselves lead to injury. But it turns out that the stresses, the strains, the deformations that are produced by the propagation of the blast are not sufficient, at least according to dynamic experiments on neurons, to lead to significant injury, at least by mechanisms that have been identified so far. So we are not, I am not comfortable yet saying that cavitation is causing traumatic brain injury, but that is a possible mechanism that, under the, well, so to speak, the right conditions, you could actually get cavitation, certainly when exposed to a strong blast, but even if you're exposed to repeated lower amplitude blasts. And we've done a bunch of modeling to try to better characterize the process. Baudouin Fonquois has been doing modeling in this context, where we've been trying to develop a relationship between certain properties of the blast and then the subsequent growth of the bubbles, taking that growth or maximum size of the bubble that gives us a measure of the stretch, which we can then based on the experiments by, and these were actually experiments that John Estrada did back when he was a student, to connect this to neuronal injury. And we can generate then injury maps depending on various properties. What I will say is that there are still tremendous uncertainties at this point. One being nuclei, and this is why we care about nucleation, is that I have no idea what the nuclei sizes are in the brain. I don't think anyone really does. I don't think this is something that's been measured or not. I've yet to see data. And so when we run our models, we're making a best guess in some ways. We think that as a starting point, the values that we got from cavitation in agarose gels is probably not a bad place to start. So micron size nuclei. Turns out that in seawater also, that might not be a bad estimate. Seawater might not be relevant, but that at least maybe in kind of those more complex media, that might be a good place to start. But there still remains work to be done in this area. So I will end here. Perhaps in the interest of time, I'll just leave this up, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
I got a question. So in experiments, we see weird stuff, and we go, what physics happened there? In numerical stuff, when you see weird stuff, how can you tell the difference between something that's physical and interesting versus numerical and the problems?
Yeah, that's a great question, and especially for some of these complex problems. So these complex problems where the cause and effect is not clear, it can be very difficult. A simple or a simplistic view of this is to distinguish between well, the physics or the model, right, the equations that you're solving, and then how you're solving those equations. And so here, this, kind of the way to think of this, a way to think of this is to think of it in terms of verification. Given a set of equations, are you solving those equations correctly? And then validation, given a model or given the results that you're getting by your model that hopefully has been verified before, are you agreeing with experiments of the same or of similar problems? In which case, if you are not, what that would mean is that you're missing physics. Now, this all seems great in principle, but there are a number of difficulties. The first one is, what if indeed you're dealing with problems that have some kind of stochastic, I don't even know if I can call it a property of behavior. I think cavitation and cavitation nucleation, for example, is a great example of that, right? I think you need more than just verification and validation. This is where maybe quantifying uncertainties or kind of probabilistic approaches might be valuable. Another issue, and this is the phase field, for example, is an example of that, is that our model, right, we have Navier-Stokes plus some terms. But those terms, one of those terms actually has a dependence on the mesh size. So now you're tying your physical model to numerics. And so things become very tricky. My answer, if your answer, or if your question specifically is about these interface problems and shockwaves and interface interactions, my answer would be now at this point is that at least now we have a mechanism to control the problematic numerical issues, or some of them, right? And there specifically, I mean that numerical diffusion and interfaces. And so from there, perhaps there's something we can do. But it turns out, and we've gone through this for other problems of interest, it can be very difficult to distinguish between the two. But ideally, you would formulate the problem as a verification versus a validation. Thank you. It's a great question.
How did you come up with the extra terms in your phase field equations?
Yeah, so I can pull that up. So just the reason I want to just go back to the equations is because I want to illustrate the fact that they are so if you set the term, I don't know if you can see easily the terms in the red here to the right. If you set them to 0, you recover your original set of equations. So as a first step, what you might think is, well, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to improve the modeling of the interface. And so perhaps a good starting point is to say, well, which ones of these in my model which equations here serve that purpose of trying to represent the interface. And really, this volume fraction equation is that first one. And so then you could start by thinking, okay, if I do want to add that model, what kind of properties do I need that model to have? And there's been a lot of work in the phase field. And of course, we didn't just, wait for inspiration to come and this is what it should look like, right? And it's beautiful and it's right. No, there's been a lot of work done in incompressible multiphase flows that we've been able to draw from, but that are challenging, or that what was not known in compressible flow is that some of these terms here are specifically there to model the compressibility of the flow, and therefore were not present in your phase field model for incompressible flow. So for example, here, if I focus on this equation, this term here that has this 1 plus k, this k here is actually is a function of the sound speeds and the relative sound speeds and the densities of the medium, and that would be 0 for incompressible flow, because there's also a divergence of u in there somewhere. And so for incompressible, perhaps all you would need is to add this part of the term, and you can see it looks like basically a diffusion term, and that this diffusion term, if you made your diffusion coefficient positive or negative, possibly, you can see how you could start diffusing or sharpening things. And so that's kind of how the phase field works, and it had to be extended to compressible flow also, and that's really the main contribution of Xiang's work. So Xiang was a postdoc in my group. He's now faculty at the University of Alabama, and he was really instrumental in doing that. And so you can start with that, and what you realize is that if you were to do that only to that one equation, that would lead to problems or inconsistencies with other fields. That, if you're doing that for the volume fraction, you want to make sure your density behaves in a way that's consistent. And if your density behaves in a way that's consistent, then your momentum and your energy. So that's kind of, without going into the details, kind of the approach that we followed there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, great question.
Wondering, does the value of the phase field variable offer any gauge in terms of the numerical digitization or modeling error?
Yeah, we've been having actually philosophical questions in my group about that. So I think so, and for that, it's actually probably easiest to just think about it in terms of this schematic that I have on the right here. So we've made the decision that we're going to use an Eulerian approach or formulation, and and we're trying to represent interfaces that are sharp. That is the that's the premise. All right, and that if that is the case, regardless of how you treat the interface, it turns out that on that Eulerian grid, there will be regions where your volume fraction is not 0 or not 1, and it has nothing to do with how you model the interface. It's just based on that choice that you made, right? So that's the first comment. And so even if you did a perfect job of representing the interface in a sharp fashion, you would have these mixed cells. And so that brings up two issues. The first one is, how do you treat these mixed cells, right? And then the second one is, well, this seems like, so there could be different ways of getting a mixed cell that if I drew here diffuse, let's say, profile, I could achieve the same volume fraction as I have here, right? Just by, well, if I could tune the numerical diffusion, right? And so there's that question of, okay, the numerics that come into play. So what I think I've been convinced of now, and then I think Mahesh, the point that you brought about that you brought before about, well, if you have these finite thickness regions of mixture that are numerical, and that you're modeling them in a way that is, well, it's physical but problematic, what do you do? And so I think that the way to go about this is to consider as thin an interface as possible, and that you can do by, choosing your, this is this parameter eta here that basically governs the thickness of the interface, is by choosing that parameter to be, well, such that you get a thin interface. What should that parameter be? It turns out that dimensionally that parameter has a length scale. And because we are trying, given that premise that we're trying to represent these sharp interfaces on a mesh, we think it makes sense that the parameter should scale with delta x. But what should that constant of proportionality be? That's really what these experiments are showing, numerical experiments are showing us. And so if it's on the order or equal to the mesh size, which is the bottom left here, seems like a reasonable, nice number. But I think in practice, what you would want is something as small as possible here. What I can't tell you is what would be the value of making that number, I don't know, 0.1, 0.001, or something even smaller. Right now, I'm not able to tell you that. And I think that probably is related to that philosophical aspect of, well, you're going to end up with a single, at best, you're going to have a one cell mixture region. How small do you need to go? And I don't know yet how to answer that question. And the question is actually related to yours that you had before, is can we formulate this in terms of a verification problem, maybe even validation problem, and then come up with a way to conduct experiments, and maybe they're numerical experiments, molecular dynamic simulations that inform us. I don't have a good answer to that.
Eric, I have one question.
Yes.
Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, this will be the last question. If you have some time. Anyone had a question there? Okay.
So I was gonna ask if you could give us some more details about what are the assumptions in that Allen-Kahn interface.
So, yeah, I guess. So we are not making a okay, what I will say is that here, think of that scenario. Let's say you have two parallel plates that are, close, relatively close to each other, meaning that the height or the separation distance is much smaller than the length, right? And that you have a porous type medium in there. There's been a lot of work that's been done to try to model the flow in those kinds of systems. And that one such model is Allen-Kahn, but there are other such models that have been proposed to describe that kind of behavior. So there is absolutely a choice that we're making here, and that we decide to go with Allen-Kahn, but one could decide to go with one versus the other. And I will tell you quite honestly that I don't know to what extent. So there are certain features in simulations that you see that can be attributed to the fact that you're using a different model, but I am not able to tell you how those features are related to the specifics of the model. And I'll give you a specific example. If you're interested, and actually in cavitation, this is irrelevant, but if you think of droplet, so let's say you have a liquid droplet that you are elongating, at some point it ends up pinching off, perhaps, right? If you're trying to represent that numerically, right, your interfaces become, closer and closer and closer. At some point, well, you need to do something with your numerics, or maybe you let the numerics take care of it, whatever, right? But that breakup process, depending on the model that you use, will have very different behaviors. Some models will actually produce daughter droplets in a certain fashion. Some other models will prevent that from happening and basically kind of cause all of the, it's called non-zero volume fraction to kind of be absorbed, so to speak, of the interface. And then these are really not very precise words. So there's a lot that is not known about what those, or the choice of models does to what you end up seeing in simulations. And in fact, when you look at these terms, I think really some of the terms you can interpret them as diffusive. Some of them you interpret them as either anti-diffusive or compression. But how do you put them together? That is less obvious. I think one aspect also here that was especially important to my postdoc was you wanted to make sure that this approach did not, so we follow kind of a fractional step approach where we solve the hyperbolic step first, maybe the physical diffusive term, and then the phase field term. And that, so you have some kind of a volume distribution, let's say, phase number one has a certain volume, phase number two, total volume, phase number two has total volume, phase number three, total volume. We want to make sure the phase field step does not change those numbers, for example. So that is something that it turns out that the conservative Allen-Kahn formulation that we're using here that property is preserved. Others would not. So there's a lot there that we could probably talk about. And I don't know if I'm answering your question. I mean, there's many facets to that question. I think that we could delve into great amount of detail. So
Thanks. Thank you very much. With that, that brings the seminar to conclusion. If you want to talk to, I think, please go ahead.
Yes.
So we'd be glad to chat. Thank you very much.